As children, we've all been told the stories about the Bermuda Triangle, about the monsters within, and the mysterious disappearances about all who travel there. But what if these places really exist? And more importantly, what if these places are the reasons for many airplane disappearances? We've compiled a list of the top 10 most bizarre aeroplane disappearances in the world. How about you let us know what you think about our list? Leave a comment down below. Number 10, Flight 19, Bermuda Triangle. On December 5th, 1945, 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers filled with 14 experienced military personnel disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle. The training flights, which took off from the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, had completed their practice when they became lost after a turn and their compasses had broken. Whilst the planes had been fully fueled before takeoff, the pilots mistakenly travelled further out to sea, believing that they were travelling back to Florida. As the weather deteriorated, Flight 19 went down, leaving no survivors. It was theorised that the aircraft may have exploded, as a common fault was that it accumulated flammable vapours in sections of the airplane, but investigators could not be certain. It was also noticed in their pre-flight checks that, strangely, all of the planes were missing clocks. Could there have been other mechanical elements that caused Flight 19 to crash? Number 9. Egypt Air Flight 990. On the 31st of October 1999, the Egypt Air Flight 990 begins its regular journey from Los Angeles to Cairo. The Boeing 767 plane made a stop at JFK International Airport. Shortly after takeoff, the flight crew's first officer begins to pilot the plane. The plane seemed to be working normally until the engines were shut down, and Flight 990 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. Rescue efforts proved futile as the crash killed all 217 of the passengers and crew aboard. The investigation into this crash proved to be controversial, as the Egyptian government was not pleased with the direction the investigation was undertaking. Arguments between the different investigation organisations meant that the cause of the crash was not fully determined, some arguing that the crash was an intentional act of the first officer, and others arguing that the crash must have been caused by a mechanical failure. This flight now runs from New York only and uses a different plane. Number 8. Stardust. On the 2nd of August 1947, the British South American Airway flight Stardust began its flight from Buenos Aires to Santiago. The Avro-Lancastrian plane and its 11 occupants did not reach their destination. Stardust crashed into Mount Tupungato in the Argentinian Andes. There were no survivors. A search of the mountainous area found nothing. No plane, no debris, and most importantly, no passengers. In fact, the wreckage was not found for 50 years until pieces of the plane were spotted in glacial ice. It's theorised that the pilots got lost whilst flying at high altitude, falsely believing that they had gone past the Andes Mountains. When they flew lower, they crashed into Mount Tupungato and became buried in the ice. Before the plane crashed, the crew sent off one final transmission in Morse code: STENDEC. The meaning of this message is unknown. Number 7. D.B. Cooper. The name D.B. Cooper was a name made famous on November 24, 1971, as an unidentified man hijacked a Boeing 727 plane mid-flight. The plane was flying between Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. The unknown man, who the press dubbed D.B. Cooper, received $200,000 in ransom money before he parachuted out of the aircraft. He was never identified or found, despite numerous investigations and searches. The FBI has suspended the investigation into this incident, and all 42 passengers and crew thankfully survived. Number 6. Pan Am Flight 7. Pan Am Flight 7, the around the world that was never meant to be. This around the world flight began in San Francisco, flying west. It was supposed to visit many international locations before returning to Philadelphia. However, on the 8th of November 1957, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, known as the Clipper Romance of the Skies, never arrived at its first destination. The aircraft instead crashed into the Pacific Ocean, killing all 44 people on board. The definitive cause of the crash was not determined. In fact, when contacted at the halfway point between the mainland US and Hawaii, Flight 7 mentioned no difficulties. Number 5. Flying Tiger, Flight 739. Flying Tiger Flight 739 was a Lockheed Constellation propliner used by the United States military to transport 93 US soldiers and 3 South Vietnamese from Travis Air Force Base, California, to Saigon, Vietnam, on March 16, 1972. The aircraft made a stop at the Anderson Air Force Base in Guam and was flying to the Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Heavy radio static meant that the Guam Air Base could not contact the crew member aboard the plane. Flight 379 and its 107 inhabitants did not arrive in the Philippines. The airliner's disappearance prompted one of the largest air and sea searches in the history of the Pacific, covering over 200,000 square miles over 8 days. Yet, no traces of the wreckage were found. The passengers and crew were presumed dead. Without physical evidence, it was difficult to determine the cause of the Flight 739's disappearance. Some argued that the aircraft probably exploded based on eyewitness observations. Others argued that the flight's disappearance was the word of sabotage. Number 4. US Air Flight 427. On the 8th of November 1994, the US Air Flight 427 departed from Chicago O'Hara International Airport on its journey to West Palm Beach, Florida. The Boeing 737 plane was to make a scheduled stop at Pittsburgh International Airport, but crashed and burned on the approach to runway 28R after hitting turbulence at high speed. None of the 127 passengers or the 5 crew members survived. This crash led to one of the longest investigations in the National Transportation Safety Board's history. The pilot, Captain Peter Germano and Charles B. Emmett III, were regarded as being excellent pilots and were very experienced. It was theorised that the cause of the crash may have been a faulty rudder, forcing the plane into a position in which the pilots were unable to counter. Number 3. TWA Flight 800. On July 17, 1996, the Trans World Airlines Flight 800 began its journey from JFK International Airport to Rome, but the Boeing 747 plane did not make it far, killing all of the 230 people aboard, making it one of the deadliest aviation accidents in US history. The cause of the crash was very speculative. Eyewitnesses described seeing streaks of light hitting TWA Flight 800, leading many to believe that the crash was due to a terrorist attack. However, after an extensive investigation, there was no evidence pointing to this explanation. It was concluded that the explosion was likely caused by a spark coming into contact with the fuel vapours in the fuel tank. Malfunctioning wiring was also found in the wreckage, suggesting that a short circuit may have been the initial ignition source. The TWA flight has a memorial that can be found at Smith Point County Park in Shirley, New York. Number 2. Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart was an American pioneer in the field of aviation. The first female aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, she is still remembered today for her extraordinary achievements. However, Earhart met her match on a 29,000-mile long around-the-world flight on July 2, 1937. Earhart began her journey at Lye Airfield, travelling in a Lockheed Model 10 Electra plane, modified to carry additional fuel for her long journey. But as Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan travelled over the Central Pacific Ocean towards their first stop, Howland Island, they mysteriously disappeared. Their disappearance led to a $4 million search by the Navy and the Coast Guard, the most expensive search of the time. Number 1. Malaysia Airlines. Bizarre plane disappearances are not just a thing of the past. More recently, on the 8th of March 2014, the Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared en route to Beijing Capital International Airport. The flight left Kuala Lumpur International Airport and travelled over the South China Sea. Shortly into the journey, the flight crew communicating with air traffic control did not report any issues. But minutes later, the Boeing 777 plane was lost from the air traffic control scanners. The plane began to head west, moving across the Malay Peninsula and the Andaman Sea, before it also became lost to military radars. The search for Flight 370 began across the South China and Andaman Seas, but the aircraft's automated communication systems indicated that the plane could have ended up in the southern Indian Ocean instead. Ultimately, 46,000 square miles of ocean were covered, but the plane was never found. Without physical evidence, the investigators could not determine the cause of Flight 370's disappearance, although theories of hijacking and communication failures have been considered. Flight 370 is to date the deadliest incident involving a Boeing 777 and the deadliest in Malaysian Airlines history. What do you think about our list? Are there any other bizarre aeroplane disappearances that we haven't mentioned? Let us know your thoughts by leaving a comment below.